A group of bikers ripped the American flag apart right in front of a crowd, disrespecting the very symbol of freedom. But just as the crowd stood in shock, Barron Trump stepped forward and did something no one expected. What happened next will leave you speechless. It was a typical afternoon in downtown Washington, D.C., and the streets were crowded with people going about their daily routines. The sound of car engines, chatter from street vendors, and the occasional laughter from tourists filled the air. But something was about to happen that would disturb the usual calm of this busy city. A group of bikers, riding loudly down the street, drew the attention of pedestrians. As they pulled up to a red light near the National Mall, one of them made a shocking move. Without any regard for the crowd around them, they pulled out an American flag and began tearing it apart, right there in broad daylight. The flag, a symbol of freedom and sacrifice, was shredded and discarded on the pavement. The sight of the torn flag hit like a punch in the gut. The people nearby stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what they had just seen. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered to each other, and a few even mumbled words of anger. An elderly woman, sitting nearby on a park bench, grabbed her tissue and dabbed at her eyes, while a man in a business suit scoffed loudly, making a comment about how people were too sensitive. The bikers laughed, enjoying the reaction they were getting from the crowd, not realizing the anger they were stirring in the hearts of those around them. For a few moments, the tension hung in the air as more people gathered, watching in uncomfortable silence. But, among the crowd, a young man stood off to the side, unnoticed by most. Barron Trump, dressed simply in a dark jacket, quietly observed the scene from a bench near the street. He wasn't part of the commotion. His expression remained calm, his gaze fixed on the bikers as they mocked the flag. There was no reaction, no rush to join the crowd or confront the bikers directly, just a quiet presence, watching, waiting. Something told those nearby that this moment would not pass without an answer. Barron's calm demeanor only added to the anticipation that he would soon make his move. As the bikers continued to laugh and joke, the mood around them grew heavier. The laughter of the bikers seemed to echo in the stillness of the crowd. People began to shift uncomfortably on the sidewalks and benches, unsure of what to do next. Some of them cast angry glances at the group, but no one moved to stop them. It was as if the scene had paralyzed the crowd, leaving them helpless and uncertain. A few of the bystanders exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman in her early 40s, standing near a newsstand, whispered to the person next to her. "I can't believe they're doing that, it's disrespectful," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the sounds of the city. The man she spoke to nodded, but neither of them moved closer to intervene. They just stood there, quietly disapproving, like many others around them. Nearby, a young couple walked by, and the man, clearly annoyed by the scene, muttered something under his breath. "What's wrong with people? They should be ashamed of themselves," he grumbled, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the traffic. His girlfriend gave him a quick, worried look, as if unsure whether to engage in the situation or just walk away. The discomfort was everywhere, but no one had the courage to do anything about it. The bikers were still carrying on with their rude behavior, oblivious to the discomfort they were causing. The bikers, noticing the discomfort around them, seemed to revel in it. One of them looked around, spotting a man in a sharp suit walking down the street, and with a smirk on his face, he called out, "Hey, what are you looking at, old man? You got a problem?" The man in the suit, who had been quietly passing by, turned sharply and looked at the biker, his face flushed with frustration. "I don't have time for this," the man muttered, brushing past him and quickening his pace. "Typical," the biker sneered, and the others joined in with laughter. The group of bikers seemed to feed off each other's negativity, growing louder and more brazen with each passing moment. As their laughter rang out, the silence from the bystanders grew louder. It wasn't that they agreed with the bikers' behavior, they were simply too stunned or afraid to say anything. The discomfort was palpable. No one had expected such an event to happen, and now they were unsure how to handle it. Barron, sitting off to the side, felt a knot form in his stomach. He could feel the tension in the air, the discontent rippling through the crowd like an electric current. He glanced around at the others, all of them trapped in their own silence. His gaze landed on the older woman who had been quietly watching from a bench. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands shaking slightly. It was clear that the disrespect the bikers were showing the flag was affecting her deeply. Barron could feel the weight of the moment. He stared at the bikers for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together. Should he get involved? Was it his place? Should he just let it go? The internal conflict churned within him. Barron was used to staying out of the spotlight, to observing and stepping back. But today was different. Today, the flag wasn't just a symbol. It was a message, one that was being torn apart by people who didn't seem to care about the sacrifices made to defend it. He wanted to stand up, to say something, but could he? Would it even make a difference? He could feel the eyes of others on him now, and his decision felt like it was weighing heavily on his shoulders. There was a long pause, and for a moment, the air was thick with anticipation. The sounds of the city faded into the background, and Barron could only hear the laughter from the bikers, the tension building, the anger of the crowd simmering. He could sense the frustration rising in the other bystanders. Would he step up, or would he remain silent? As he sat there, still observing, a middle-aged man approached the group of bikers, his face red with anger. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage, but just as he was about to speak, the biker who had been leading the mocking gestures waved him off with a dismissive hand. "Save it, pal. If you don't like it, you can walk away. Not everyone's here to salute the flag like you," the biker sneered. The man hesitated, his expression conflicted. He opened his mouth to respond, but before any more words were spoken, the discomfort in the crowd seemed to mount even further. The tension was now unbearable. The situation was deteriorating fast. As Barron sat quietly, the growing tension in the air weighed heavily on him. Around him, people shifted uncomfortably, casting disapproving glances but saying nothing. It was as if the crowd had been paralyzed by fear or indecision, unwilling to stand up to the bikers' disrespect. Barron could feel the frustration building within him. How long could this go on without anyone stepping forward? How long could they remain silent? He had always been the quiet observer, content to stay out of the spotlight, but today, something was different. The bikers' actions weren't just a personal attack, they were a slap in the face to the values Barron held dear. The longer the disrespect continued, the more it gnawed at him. Then, one of the bikers made a careless remark, "Who cares about a stupid flag anyway?" Barron's heart skipped a beat. That was the tipping point. He couldn't sit back any longer. With a deep breath, Barron stood. His decision was clear now. He wasn't going to wait for someone else to act. He was going to make a stand, no matter the discomfort, no matter the opposition. Barron Trump would not let this moment pass without doing what was right. Barron's thoughts raced. The people around him, the man trying to intervene, the woman wiping away her tears, how much longer could this go on? How much longer would people just sit there in silence? Was this really what it had come to? Barron Trump stood tall, his presence immediately cutting through the tension in the air. The bikers, who had been laughing and mocking the flag just moments ago, were now silent, their attention shifting to the young man standing before them. Barron's gaze was steady, unwavering, his voice calm but firm. Without raising his voice, he spoke, addressing the group directly. "Why are you doing this?" His question was simple, yet it carried a weight that made everyone pause. What's the point of tearing apart something that represents the sacrifices of so many people? The bikers, who had been brash and loud just moments before, now stood still, caught off guard by Barron's calm demeanor. One of them, unable to mask his defensiveness, scoffed, "What's the big deal, kid? It's just a flag." Barron didn't flinch. He looked the man in the eye and replied, "It's not just a flag. It's a symbol of freedom, of honor, and of those who gave their lives so that people like you and me could live freely. That flag means something, it means more than you could ever understand." The crowd around them had gone silent. People who had been uncomfortable, avoiding the situation, were now watching, their eyes on Barron. The weight of his words hung in the air. He wasn't shouting or making a scene, he was simply speaking the truth, and the silence that followed spoke volumes. Another biker, clearly still unbothered, sneered, "We don't need some lecture. No one cares about that flag. It's just a piece of cloth." Barron's response was measured, but the power behind his words grew. "That piece of cloth," he said, his voice unwavering, "represents the very freedoms we take for granted. It's not about the cloth, it's about what it stands for. The lives of people who sacrificed everything for this country. People who gave up their future, their families, their lives so we could live free." Barron's words had cut through the noise, and for the first time, they were faced with the weight of their actions. The crowd around them, once tense and divided, began to shift. Some nodded, others stood straighter, their expressions softening. It was as if Barron had given them permission to acknowledge the disrespect they had witnessed. Barron took another step forward, never breaking his gaze from the bikers. "You can mock it, you can laugh, but you can't take away what it represents. You can't change the sacrifices that were made for that flag. And if you don't understand that, then maybe you should stop and think about it." For a moment, there was only silence. The bikers, once filled with defiance, were now quiet. The crowd was still, the weight of Barron's words settling over them. A veteran near the front of the group, who had been silent until now, slowly stood up. His movements were deliberate, and he placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've reminded us all what really matters." Barron nodded once, a small but significant gesture, before he turned and walked to a nearby seat. Without saying another word, he placed a small American flag on the empty chair, just above where the casket had been stored below. The action was simple, but the message was clear. Respect. Sacrifice. Honor. The bikers stood in stunned silence, the once loud and defiant group now humbled. Barron didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. Barron's quiet gesture, the placement of the flag, spoke volumes. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it had a profound effect. As the flag rested on the seat, the crowd grew silent. For the first time, the bikers' mockery faltered. Barron's simple act of respect forced everyone to pause and reflect. The bikers, who had been so vocal moments before, now found themselves at a loss for words. Their defiance had been met with a gesture they couldn't mock. The flag on the empty seat, resting where the casket had been, now held their attention, and something changed in the atmosphere. A few people in the crowd, who had been quietly watching, began to realize the depth of the moment. One by one, they shifted, glancing at the bikers, and then back to Barron. The air, once thick with discomfort, grew quiet with respect. Some nodded in agreement, understanding the importance of what had just occurred. The shift was clear, the crowd that had been divided and unsure now stood united in reflection. The bikers, their earlier bravado melting away, exchanged glances. There was no anger in their eyes anymore, only a silent recognition of the weight Barron had placed on them. In that moment, it wasn't Barron's words that mattered, it was the act of standing up that forced everyone to question their own actions. The bikers didn't apologize, but their silence said everything. The crowd had spoken, not with words, but with the strength of their collective silence. After Barron spoke, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The bikers who had been mocking the flag stood still, no longer laughing or making their usual arrogant comments. The crowd, which had been uncomfortable and uncertain moments ago, now found itself in a moment of collective silence. Barron's words, simple yet powerful, had left their mark. There was no immediate applause, no loud reactions, but the mood in the air was undeniably different. Barron didn't wait for recognition or praise. His presence alone had commanded respect, and his quiet defiance against the disrespectful bikers had drawn a clear line. As he walked away from the scene, he wasn't looking for thanks. He didn't need to be the center of attention. His action had already done what it needed to, reminded everyone of the importance of respect. The crowd began to shift, from discomfort to quiet reflection. One by one, people in the crowd began to nod or exchange looks, recognizing the weight of Barron's intervention. The veteran who had been sitting nearby, observing in silence, stood up slowly. He walked toward Barron, and with a simple gesture, placed his hand over his heart. "Thank you, son," he said softly, his voice filled with respect. The crowd, once divided, now stood united in the shared understanding of the moment. Some passengers, who had initially muttered in annoyance or frustration, now looked back with visible guilt. One man, who had previously mocked the situation, turned away from the bikers, his expression softening as he realized the depth of the disrespect. His eyes, once filled with defiance, now reflected a growing sense of shame. The bikers, for their part, had nothing more to say. They stood silently, their bravado dissipated in the wake of Barron's words. The tension in the air had finally broken, and what had been a chaotic, disrespectful scene was now one of quiet contemplation. Barron's quiet but powerful stand had done more than just silence the bikers. It had shifted the hearts and minds of everyone present. The crowd, which had once been uneasy and unsure, now stood in shared reflection. They had been reminded of something far greater than their schedules, their frustrations, or their immediate desires. The importance of respect, for the flag, for the fallen, for each other, had been made clear in the simplest and most direct way possible. Barron didn't need to lecture or argue. He didn't need to shout or make grand speeches. His actions spoke for themselves, reminding everyone of the sacrifices made by those who had come before them. As Barron walked away from the scene, the crowd remained still. Some people placed their hands over their hearts, others whispered words of appreciation or regret. The bikers, once the center of the chaos, now stood apart, their earlier arrogance deflated. Barron had given them all a lesson in humility, not by force or anger, but by respecting the values that truly matter. It wasn't just about the flag. It was about recognizing the sacrifices that had been made for the freedoms they often took for granted. Today, Barron showed that respect for others, regardless of background or belief, can change the course of a moment. Take a moment today to reflect on the sacrifices of others, those who gave everything so we could live free. Ask yourself, what can you do to show respect for those who've come before you? What actions can you take to honor their sacrifices, even in small ways? Let's not forget the true value of respect. Every small action, no matter how simple, has the power to remind us of what really matters. Carry that lesson forward, and stand for what's right, even when it's difficult.